black can actually go for rook takes on c3, which I think what Alireza has missed while going for this rook takes on e6 move, which is still something extremely rare that such a talented and gifted player as Alireza would miss. It like simply doesn't happen, as I already said. Hey everybody, in this video we're gonna have a look on the biggest upset in over the board chess from the recent history, which happened in the game between Alireza Firouzja back in 2019 when he was rated 2669 against talented girl from Germany, Antonia Ziegenfuss, who at the time was rated 1945. So as you can see right off the bat, a rating difference bigger than 700 points. So you may be wondering, well, how on earth is that possible? How can somebody who's 700 points lower rated can win with the black pieces in an over-the-board classical time control against Alireza Firouzja? So in this video, we'll try to ask these questions. Without further introduction, let's just dive right into the game. So this is taking place in the round 4 of the Grenke Open in 2019. White opens up with e4. We have a Sicilian after c5, knight f3, e6, and after d4, we do get the open Sicilian. Black goes c takes on d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, hitting the e4 pawn. White simply defends, and after the move knight to c6, black is already sending an invitation to these super hot topical lines of the 4th knight Sicilian that will arise after some crazy fury. Knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, e5, knight e5, knight e4. Black can now play queen c7, hitting the e5 pawn. White defends with f4. Fury normally goes queen b6, c4, hitting the knight, but black has a very annoying intermediate move by going bishop b4 check. King to e2 is the best reply for white, and after the moves f5, counter-attacking the knight, knight f2, and now bishop a6, pinning the c4 pawn, white's best reaction would be simply going king to f3, leading to crazy positions that are known to be somewhat holding for black. However, the game is incredibly complicated. So Alireza, being the higher rated guy, not interested in any of these and decides to go for a different continuation. And instead of any of this, he simply plays the move knight d to b5, which is an invitation to enter the Sveshnikov positions, because normally what black does in this position is simply trying to stop the check on d6 by going for this pawn push, and the line usually continues with bishop to f4, hitting the d6 pawn, e5, and then bishop to g5, and we have magically got a transposition to the Sveshnikov Sicilian, one of Magnus Carlsen's favorites. But black also not interested in getting the Sveshnikov. Plays a very sort of interesting and underrated variation after the move knight d b5. Simply decides to stick with bishop to c5, which is a very sneaky approach because it's saying, all right, you want that check? You can go for it. I don't really care. And then their idea is to play the move king to e7. Yes, I know how crazy it looks. Open Sicilian, black is simply bone clouding. But apparently after knight takes on c8, rook takes on c8, black's position is pretty easy to play. They want to continue with moves such as a6, queen c7, rook hd8, king f8. The king will eventually manage to get to a pretty safe spot, and black has a pretty comfortable position. So Alireza, being pretty well aware of this, decides not to take but to stick to mainline Fury, and instead of the check, he decides to develop the bishop and threatening an unpleasant fork. Now black castles and we have bishop to c7. We're still following mainline Fury. The only reasonable square for the queen is e7. And now white steps back with the bishop, going bishop to d6, hitting both the enemy queen and the bishop, forcing a favorable endgame. So black goes bishop takes, queen takes, and now they decide to go for the sort of old way of playing this position, which is knight e8, simply leading to a pretty solid yet suffering endgame for black. Forcing queens off, white goes for a long castle, and black hits in the center with a move f5, seeking for activity and threatening to take on e4, with the idea that if white does nothing, black is gonna take on e4, and after knight takes on e4, d5, knight has to move, and then now that the rook is open, black could possibly collect the f2 pawn with a better position. So in the game, Alireza, I think at this point already a little bit on his own, just plays the move bishop to d3, which is an interesting approach to the position. However, I think the best objectively would have been to simply go for e5, and according to the computer, white should be slightly better in these type of endgames because the enemy light square bishop is pretty passive. However, in the game, we see this bishop to d3 move, which was met by natural play. Black simply took on e4. We have knight takes on e4, covering the f2 pawn. And now it's time for black to strike in the center with d5, hitting the e4 knight. Now, Alireza's idea was to go for knight to g5, letting black to take on f2 because that will simply allow a move such as bishop takes on h7, which is leading to a much worse position for black because after king h8, rook f1, the position is opening up and white's leading development really starts to get felt. So instead of this, black prefers to hit the white knight with the move h6, but Alireza slides back over to f3, blocking the f-file for the enemy rook and making sure that the f2 pawn remains safe. We have knight to c6, simply activating the knight and introducing ideas of e5, potentially expanding in the center. And now Alireza goes for bishop to g6, saying that if you go e5, then the point is that we can take the enemy knight, followed by a very unpleasant fork with knight to c7, winning the exchange. So instead of this, black decides to start challenging the b5 knight by playing the move a6, with the main point that taking on e8 is no longer a great move because black will not take the bishop because that will allow the fork after knight to c7 and white wins. But instead, because of this a6 move, there will be a takes on b5 intermediate move, after which black has a double threat of rook e8 and also rook takes on a2, winning white's pawn. And a position like, let's say, bishop takes on c6, pawn takes on c6, a3 should be quite comfortable for black after a simple move such as rook a4, ideas of going b4, potentially expanding, and even though the bishop looks to be a little bit passive at the moment, black gets a lot of initiative on the queen side. So instead of this, Alireza simply decides to centralize the knight and just slide back over to d4. We see knight takes on d4, white takes back with the rook, and now black starts improving the knight with knight d6. We see rook e1, bringing the last piece into the game, which black replied by going rook f6, overprotecting e6, and more important, hitting the annoying g6 bishop. We see bishop back to d3, and now black goes for the typical Sicilian play by pushing b5. White makes a prophylactic move, playing rook e2, preparing knight e5 without losing the f2 pawn, because if you would have played it immediately, then rook takes on f2 would have been quite problematic. So Alireza first moves the rook one step in front. And now black goes for a very interesting maneuver, simply playing rook a7 with the idea that after knight e5, there is rook to c7. And because there was not such an appealing square for the light square bishop, black decides, okay, let's just let the bishop on c8 protect all the important pawns, and we can just try to maneuver the pieces around it. Don't get me wrong, even though white's position is still super pleasant, when I first saw this, I just assumed white should be strategically winning. But I really want to highlight the defensive play in this game, at least up to this point by Antonia Ziegenfuss, because she's playing incredibly well in a very difficult position. She's only a little bit worse because that's how the opening goes. It's not because Alireza did anything special, it's just that that's how it goes sometimes when you have the black pieces. Now white continued with b3, simply taking away the important c4 square from the enemy knight. We have knight to f5, hitting the d4 rook, and now white simply decides to trade it and get into a typical position that will most of the times appear from the French defense, where white has the typically good knight on e5 against the enemy bad French bishop. Now white continues with a4, trying to create another weakness on the queen side, and black simply goes for king to f8, trying to bring the king closer to the middle of the board. Going for b captures on a4 would have been a very big mistake, because after rook takes on a4, black is now having an isolated pawn on a6 that is an additional target. So instead of this, we see the move king to f8 by black. Now we see a trade of pawns, followed by g4, hitting the enemy rook and trying to grab space on the king side. Rook steps back to f6, and now we see f4, continuously expanding. Black brings the king closer to the center, and white continues to push on the king side. We see king to d6, followed by king b2, and now black tries to bring the rook back into the game by going rook to f8. Idea to go bishop d7 and then slide the rook over to the either c or a file. White decides to reposition the knight with knight d3 because the knight was standing really well on e5, but the problem is that it's blocking the access towards the weak pawn on e6. So usually to attack such pawns, you need to move away the strong knight, even though it's such a beautiful placed piece. We see bishop to d7, knight to b4, bishop to c6, and now white decides to fix the enemy king side by going h5, which is usually a very important move that will allow you sooner or later to create a passed pawn after a move such as g5. Now black simply plays a waiting game, goes bishop to b7, basically saying that, alright, I'm happy with a draw anytime, I'm just gonna stay solid and let white force this if they want to win it. Alireza goes rook e1, potentially preparing to swing the rook over to the a file, and black goes for a little bit of an aggressive move by going king to c5, hitting both the rook and the b4 knight. And it's in this position where Alireza simply made a shocking blunder by going for rook captures on e6, which black simply replied by going king takes on d4. And all of a sudden, black is up a rook with a completely winning position, which is simply a mistake that never really happens in over the board chess. You may be wondering, but okay, how did Alireza miss the fact that the d4 rook was hanging? I mean, black obviously attacked it with a king and there is like nothing fancy going on. How could a world-class player as Alireza simply miss something like that? So here we can only speculate about this, but my educated guess is that after rook takes on e6, king takes on d4, he calculated the move c3, where if black goes king back onto c5, there is a checkmate in one with knight to d3. The enemy king has no squares, rook covers all these squares, knight is checking the king, and these pawns are covering all the other squares that the king would have had. But the big problem with this is that if we go back a little bit after the move c3, black can actually go for rook takes on c3, which I think what Alireza has missed while going for this rook takes on e6 move, which is still something extremely rare that such a talented and gifted player as Alireza would miss. It like simply doesn't happen, as I already said. Now, to give you a little bit of an insight, whenever you have such positions as white, like the one he had after king c5, where white has a very safe position, all the pieces are protecting each other, you can make a simple move such as c3, and it is very obvious that white is the only one that can ever win this game. We have very active rooks, we have a good knight against a bad bishop, we have a target on e6. The only problem in this position is that we have one weakness, the e6 pawn. In order to win such games, you will need a second weakness. Because normally if you just keep attacking the e6 pawn, guess what? Black will simply use both of his rook, use the bishop as well, and they will obviously be able to keep the e6 pawn well protected. And after I did a little bit of research in this position, I actually didn't find it obvious at all to find a winning plan for white. Frankly speaking, I don't think this is a win against perfect play, even though it is such a rare case that white has such a dominant strategical position. That to me is simply really hard to believe that black can ever escape such scenarios. But you know how they say, easier said than done. So I think the main justification behind the blunder made by Alireza is that he was simply a bit overconfident, maybe perhaps played it a little bit fast and simply didn't feel the danger of this position, because after rook takes on e6, black captured the rook, was not afraid, and it turns out black is completely winning. However, it's still very impressive how black finished this game, because even though Alireza is down a rook, the enemy king is still a little bit vulnerable. You'll see that white is gonna try out a lot of annoying tricks. So game continue with f5, we see rook f7, a very strong move by black, simply preparing to bring the rook over the open e file. We see knight d3, rook f e7, and white goes for the tricky knight f4, with the idea that if you take, white takes with the knight and then wins back the rook and is finally fighting back to a draw. But of course, no such thing happened, and we see the move b4, fixing white's king in a little bit of a mating net. We see the pawn moving to f6, g takes on f6, rook takes on f6, and now black does the right thing, is seeking for more trades with rook f7. This may look like a blunder at first, because white has knight e6 check, but black has everything under control after the move king e5, hitting both the f6 rook and the e6 knight. You cannot take the c7 rook because the other one from f6 remains undefended. So white played on for a few more moves, went for rook takes on h6, but after the cold-blooded rook c3, knight d8, double attack, but now black has a brilliant finish after the move rook to f2, which simply forced resignation. Now, a simple line, if you take the bishop, the point was rook takes on c2, followed by rook c1, king b2, and now this is a checkmate because of the b4 pawn that is taking away the enemy square on a3. So the main learning from this video should be, no matter how good the position is, never relax, double check your lines, and in case you're on the defensive side, always try to look for some chances, because if black was simply too afraid of her opponent that was 700 rating points stronger, she would perhaps not even consider taking the free rook, assuming that there must be a checkmate. But because she had the right attitude, she was able to not only collect the rook but also continue in energetic fashion and eventually score the win of her career. So if you find this video any helpful and want to win against opponents that are 700 rating points stronger than you, make sure to hit the like button, check the video that will appear on the screen, and I'll see you around on the channel. So thanks for watching and take care.